Welcome to Athens Happens. I'm Ben Peters, managing editor at The New Political. Athens Happens is a weekly news podcast brought to you by reporters at TNP who are dedicated to explaining the nuances of Athens and state politics. You can find new episodes every Friday at thenewpolitical.com, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or wherever else podcasts can be downloaded. This week, Ohio University is experiencing a student enrollment deficit as incoming classes are becoming smaller than their graduating counterparts, and how the city's rental housing market places students at a disadvantage when doing business with landlords. Staff writer Eric Boll on Ohio University's enrollment deficit and what it could mean for the university's future. How are you, Eric?
I'm good. I'm excited to be back in the pod. It was weird having like 2 months off of not being able to be in this room where we just sit and talk about articles.
You took a months-long hiatus.
Yes, I did.
So you've spent months working on this story right now about enrollment at Ohio University.
Mm-hmm.
Take me through how you got all this information about declining enrollment at Ohio University.
So really, I had to work a lot with the university communications team, the PR team of Ohio University.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to send in a lot of data requests, and I met with them a lot.
Yeah.
Like 2 hour long. Most of our meetings were like 2 to 3 hours long, just going over enrollment and how certain factors play into enrollment. So it all kind of started way back in like September when the university put out the 15-day look into the semester at like enrollment, because I know the Athens News, I believe, reported on it, and I read that article and I'm like, it's down, but by how much?
Can you just give context for what that is? I'm not familiar with it.
So the 15-day enrollment check, that's not the official term they use, but on the 15th day of fall semester, they check on the like numbers in their system for like who's enrolled.
Okay.
And they'll like, divide it up into like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, etc. And it's just a way to check and like make standard enrollment, because every university does like on the 15th day of the semester. That's
the university administration does this?
Yeah.
Okay.
More specifically, it is the Office of Institutional Research who just collects data and notices trends to report to administrators.
Okay. And what did you notice in this data set that they released?
So specifically, like the 2019 numbers, there were only 4,750 first-year students.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all those students who are coming to college for like the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And they remarked that was down, so I looked into it. And in 2015, that number was about by 1,000 more. So enrollment's down by like 1,000 for students coming to the university for like the first time they've ever gone to college.
So in 4 years, the numbers dropped by 1,000?
Yeah. So that's a pretty sizable decrease there. And then for transfer students, in 2016, it was around 2,000. And now it's around 1,500. So that's a 25% decline. So it is not very healthy for the university to be kind of hemorrhaging students like this. Students.
So why is it a problem that enrollment is declining so significantly at Ohio University?
So everyone knows we all pay tuition. Every student at Ohio University pays tuition in some way, shape, or form, be it through scholarships. They're just rich and can pay it directly, or they take out loans. So if you have less students, your tuition money like coming into the university is going to go down, and that is going to affect the university's operating budget.
I see. And it is negatively affecting it?
Presumably so. I can't like 100% say for certain because I can't see how much money like the differences have been. Okay. But
so you didn't get any of the financial?
No, I did not get a look at like any of the financial documents.
I see. So what is the reason for this dramatic decrease in first-year students coming to Ohio University?
So there are a couple theories. None of them are absolutely for certain because you can't really get guarantees for enrollment. What is for certain, though, is that across the Midwest and in Ohio, graduation rates, like the amount of not graduation rates, just the amount of people graduating from high school and projected to graduate from high school has gone down. So the way they do these numbers are a person goes into kindergarten in the state of Ohio. Then kids going to kindergarten at the age of 6.
Something like that.
Yeah. 12, 13 years later, they'll be 18, 19. They'll be seniors in high school and they'll be graduating.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at the amount of people going into kindergarten and kind of project the high school graduation rate for the future.
I see.
And, people will move out of the state, but people will move in to replace them. So it's a relatively stable number for those projections.
And who's making these projections?
So these are from the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. They're kind of I want to say educational think tank, but I don't believe that's like the exact wording that they would use. But basically they do research on education.
Okay.
And they have profiles for like regions. So Midwest, East Coast, West Coast, and like the South are the regions they split up like America up into. And then they have like state projections. So you can go and look at those, and you can also look at the national projections.
And Ohio's in the Midwest.
Yeah, Ohio's in the Midwest section. So Ohio's graduation amount of people graduating. I keep wanting to say graduation rate. The amount of people graduating is expected to drop from around 135,000 to around 110,000. So that's by 2032. So that's not going to be like...
So in a decade.
Yeah, in about a decade. And it's been on the decline since, I believe, like the early 2010s. But it's gonna go down a lot more. And the Midwest has like a similar overall trend, with it expected to go down going well into the 2030s. But for the U.S. graduation rate, overall, it's actually expected to go up when compared to like the 2000s.
So let me get this straight. The number of people graduating high school in the Midwest and the state of Ohio is decreasing.
Yes, that is correct.
But the general trend nationwide is increasing.
I mean, it's not like a consistent increase. Like it's an increase compared to like where it was in the 2000.
Okay.
So nationwide, it is going to be higher than it was before, but it's not going to be the highest it ever was.
Okay. And did any of your reporting indicate any reasons as to why this would be?
Honestly, birth rates. It's an unsatisfactory answer, but it's just people are having less kids.
Mm-hmm.
So less kids, less people graduating from high school in 18 years.
The population's aging in the state of Ohio too. I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
Yeah, that would have something to do with it because less people would be going to college.
I see.
But the real big issue for what this means for the university is that right now the university is already in a bit of a tight financial spot.
Yeah.
And with enrollment going down, that's not going to help at all. And the university has some projections for like how they're going to do in the future, but those are projections, and projections aren't 100% accurate.
And what are those projections showing?
I don't have it pulled up on my computer, so I'm going to try and say this from memory. I believe they're expecting to see a bit more of an uptick in enrollment going into the early 2020s.
Okay.
But if we still look at like the high school amount of people expected to graduate from high school, that's still expected to go down into 2032. So unless the university manages to just not get caught up in that, which would be a miracle, quite frankly.
Well, I mean, they could get students from out of state, international,
yeah,
out of the Midwest region.
About like 80% of Ohio University students are from Ohio. So having the university be built around Ohio students and then having the Ohio graduation rate go down means that the university will likely see a further decline in enrollment going on until the next decade.
And so if this is true all across the state of Ohio, that graduation rates are expected to fall, wouldn't other universities in the state be experiencing similar declines in enrollment?
So right now, that's not necessarily true.
Why?
Honestly, I wish I could tell you why other schools are going up, but they're not going down.
Okay.
So Ohio State University has gone up, which OSU is honestly a little bit of an outlier for the state of Ohio because they're such a large, well-known university. They attract a lot of students from out of state and international students. So we could throw OSU out of this discussion for now. What is interesting, however, is the University of Cincinnati has gone up. And they are comparable in size to OU. They have experienced growth, while we've experienced a decline, and Kent State University, another university with a similar student population to OU, has also experienced a decline of almost roughly the same number of students.
As OU?
Yeah. Meanwhile, Miami University, which is OU's direct rival, rival for sports. They're not a direct rival for like education per se. They've also experienced a bit of growth. Whereas Bowling Green State University has maintained steady enrollment. They haven't really gone up or down, and Cleveland State has also shrunk. And all these numbers are all the 15-day enrollments, so they're all the same parameters for the data.
So, I mean, how could that be? How is it that the numbers at OU are falling while these other places are, either hanging on or rising?
That is a fantastic question that no one really knows the answer to, or no one would help me find the answer to.
Did you ask any?
So here's the thing with numbers from other schools is every school makes numbers a little complicated to get. I asked these schools and I said, give me your general just enrollment. Having to get out of state school, having to go to them and say, how many are your international students? How many are your out of state students? How many are native Ohio students? I'd also have to try and project where these students applied. And that's information that I would have to gather from 8 schools. So I wish I could tell you why certain schools have gone up and why certain schools have gone down, but I just didn't have the resources to try and get a hold of that info.
I see. Fair enough. So what does this mean for the future of Ohio University?
So the university is expected to go down in enrollment.
Yeah.
And that's probably not good for the school's money going into the future. They'll have less tuition money coming into the school. And with it already being in a tight budget situation, who knows what will happen?
The future's uncertain.
The future is extremely uncertain.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate your time.
Yep.
Digital managing editor Sarah Dancin will join me shortly after the ad read to talk about landlord and tenant relations in Athens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maggie Prosser, editor-in-chief here at The New Political. Each and every day, I work alongside reporters, editors, producers, and managers who put their heart and soul into the journalism we produce. Here at TNP, we have the honor to tell the stories of the residents of this small town we call home. We're looking for local businesses and other ventures to help us continue funding for our independent journalism, including the podcast you're listening to right now. TNP would love to advertise for you through our website, our biannual magazine, or right here on Athens Happens. If interested, please send an inquiry email to execedit@thenewpolitical.com for more details. We hope working together can support both your initiative and fuel TNP's strong, reliable, and essential journalism here in Athens.
Digital managing editor Sarah Donaldson on the skewed power dynamic between tenants in Athens and their landlords. How are you, Sarah?
I'm doing well, Ben. It's really cold out today. We were all just talking about that. It got really cold after it got dark, but I'm doing really well otherwise.
Awesome. So you, for the New Political's winter magazine, our first ever winter magazine.
Yes, sir.
Wrote a story that I feel like should have been written in Athens before, but I don't think it has. And it's about tenant and landlord relations and how that manifests itself in the everyday lives of college students. So can you just begin by telling us a little bit about what that relationship looks like?
Yeah, and this is a massive story, so I think that I kind of took it from one angle. I think there's so many angles to take it from, but it was definitely something really interesting to report on. In Athens, renters are primarily students, and students are a very transient population. We kind of come in for a couple of years and then we leave Athens, and that kind of transient population makes up the bulk of who is renting places in Athens. But I will say, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit later, a lot of more permanent residents have kind of been forced to rent places versus buying a home or apartment in Athens, just kind of based on how the housing situation has worked out recently. And I want to talk about that a little later, but typically the landlord-renter dynamic in Athens is students, upperclassmen often renting from local landlords. You know, and I know that Kimberly Francis, she is the managing attorney at the Center for Student Legal Services. She kind of talked about how that makes Athens very unique. It's a smaller city, and it's basically kind of not run by the university. The city's not obviously run by the university, and obviously the city and the university kind of have this weird relationship, but the university does play a huge role in how the city operates.
One really couldn't exist without the other.
No, absolutely. And Pat McGee, when I talked to him, he kind of identified 3 issues that he sees in this relationship with landlords and student tenants specifically. He talked about, you know, students are signing their leases super far in advance. So like, Ben, I don't know when you signed your lease, but I'm a sophomore and I'm still living in the dorms, and I signed my lease, I think, in July after my freshman year, because we felt this pressure that we were like, oh my gosh, we're not going to get a house if we don't sign this early. And Pat McGee said that can cause a real issue. He also said that one thing, and we're going to probably talk about this a little later, a lot of the leases that are offered in Athens have joint and several liability. So like if you sign with 2 other people, so like I'm signed with my roommate Lindsay and my roommate Lexi, if something gets broken in the house, all 3 of us are responsible for it, even if it was maybe me that broke it, or Lindsay that broke it, or Lexi that broke it. So that can kind of make the relationship between specific tenants and their landlords a little more interesting, because it can cause issues when legal disputes come in.
So does that mean that you and your 3 roommates would equally split the cost of any damages per se?
It's kind of a loose definition, these joint and several liability leases, but essentially from what I understand, everyone's responsible for the damages, and it's up to, you know, maybe you talk to your roommate about that, but like legally, if it's a joint and severally liable lease, yes, to my understanding. And another thing that Pat McGee brought up was this concept of alternative rent that has kind of come about in Athens. And this is something like, you know, a little bit later, if we're maybe talking about some of the things that both Kimberly and Pat cautioned against. This concept of alternative rent, it's like discounted, quote unquote, if you pay the rent by a certain date, and after that date the rent goes up automatically. And some landlords in Athens offer this, but Pat McGee said it's kind of a reversal of reality. In reality, you're paying a jacked up price after that date, and oftentimes that discounted rate is usually what a landlord would offer to begin with. So it's kind of this way that landlords are trying to bring people in by saying, oh look, I offer this discounted rent before this date. But it becomes really tricky, because if you've got 7 or 8 people paying rent and one of them is late, then the price gets jacked up for all 8 people. So it's kind of this interesting concept that is, some landlords offer it, and it's not necessarily, at least according to Pat McGee, a good thing.
And we should also mention Pat McGee is a retired lawyer at the student.
He's former managing attorney at the Center for Student Legal Services, so he used to do the job that Kimberly now does, and he's also a former city council member.
Yeah,
so he's kind of seen the landlord tenant issue in Athens from both like a city councilman's perspective and from a lawyer's perspective. So yeah, that's kind of what it looks like right now. You know, it's primarily upperclassmen renting, and there's some issues that kind of come in with this transient population.
So are there any efforts being made at the policy level, like what Pat McGee used to be doing at the city council, to regulate the relationship between a landlord and tenant?
Sure. So it's city council can only do so much, as to what Pat McGee explained to me. A lot of the enforcement of landlords, like enforcing landlords to comply with like code enforcement and stuff, is up to like the executive parts of the city. So like the mayor's office, the city law director's office, that kind of falls on them. But city council kind of comes in when it comes to like criminal punishments for landlords. And so, you know, like former mayoral candidate Damon Crane and former city council candidate Ellie Hamrick, both of them lost, but they were talking a lot about like landlord issues, and what they were pushing for were sufficient number of code enforcement officers, because they believe that like we don't have enough code enforcement officers right now to be like truly checking if these landlords are following code.
Can you explain what a code enforcement officer does, just briefly?
I don't really know if I can specifically explain it. I don't know if that's something like I can do right off the top of my head. But essentially, what I understand is if there's like a complaint or something, they will be the one to check out the property. And they also do like checks of properties if they're following code. But it's not necessarily like, I think Ellie Hamrick and Damon Crane's concern were that they weren't always like checking that things were truly up to standard. It's kind of like a muddy thing.
Okay.
But Pat McGee kind of said, the city's been pretty lax as trying to the city just in general has been pretty lax as far as trying to put the pressure on landlords. He said, although he has noticed recently there might be a little bit of a bigger push on some of them. The specific day that I talked to Pat McGee, there was actually a landlord in court. He didn't name which landlord, but there was a landlord in court. And he also mentioned that, it is something that he kind of sees like, and, you may know this as well as me, but he said, there's a couple of landlords in town that traditionally have a lot of problems with students, and it's kind of recognizable names. And again, he didn't name them, but it's kind of recognizable names that they're either constantly suing students for money or students are suing them for conditions. And, he said the council can always do something that makes it possible to protect tenants. But there's this issue that 2 members of council are landlords, but there's no tenants serving on council. So Pat McGee kind of believes that there's a council that's like not really sympathetic to tenants. They're more sympathetic to the issues that landlords face. So it's this interesting relationship that, city council is made up of more landlords than tenants, so tenants may not necessarily be represented on city council. He said he was kind of talking about how council's more worried about like we don't want students to take over Palmer Street for Palmer Fest or kind of like the students to take over Athens or anything like that, and maybe less concerned about like protecting tenants.
So I just wanted to note that the landlords on council,
Sarah Grace and Peter Costas are
yeah.
both the landlords on council.
And both of them only own a few properties,
Yes.
as opposed to like some of these bigger landlords like Procos or Cornwell around town who own hundreds of properties.
Yeah, I think he just kind of, I know he did kind of emphasize that it was still that there isn't a tenant currently serving on council, which when you are in a population that a lot of people are tenants, that's not necessarily something that's representative. And this kind of impacts like year-round residents too, like kind of how I was saying, because he said that one issue that he sees are houses are bought up by landlords because these houses in Athens are so profitable, because like landlords can make a lot of money renting out these places year after year. So it's much harder for maybe someone who's coming in who's not a student who wants to start a family in Athens and live in Athens. It's much harder for that individual to like actually make a purchase on a property. And he also brought into question, and this kind of pulls away from the city and actually has to do with the university and how the university could be pushing this issue. But he said that Ohio University comes into play because he feels like OU is reinforcing the landlord's demand for buying up properties because they continue to reduce the number of beds on campus. So you see
by tearing down residence halls.
Absolutely. So he said that this is an issue that he sees, and it's not even something that I would have ever thought about. But he said, OU continues to tear down beds. And additionally, he was like, he said to me, how much do you like living in the dorms? OU doesn't really make it marketable to live in the dorms. They've got students living on campus for the first 2 years, but after that, students are so ready to get off campus. And Pat McGee kind of sees that as a problem. He said, maybe loosen up some of the restrictions in the dorms, more people would be staying on campus, and this puts less pressure on landlords to be like buying up all these properties and having as many rental properties as possible available. So that was another issue that Pat McGee kind of brought up.
So did anybody who you spoke to for the story, Pat McGee or otherwise, give any sort of advice to students signing leases on what they should be looking for so that they don't fall into a predatory situation?
Absolutely, yeah. Both Pat McGee and Kimberly Francis kind of had some advice. Kimberly Francis said it's like super important to know your landlord, and that doesn't mean just like introducing yourself and shaking their hands. Research these people online, check out the court dockets, call code enforcement, check out all the public records that are available to you. And Pat McGee also really emphasized that. He said, look your landlord up on the court dockets and see how many times their name came up. And I don't want to don't quote me on this, but like I was kind of going through and looking up landlords, and you look up, I think, Procos, and his name comes up 80 times on the court docket. So he's appeared in court a lot. And it's also interesting to generally look up any landlord and also look up their business name. That's something I didn't mention earlier. They also said don't just look up the landlord's name, also look up their rental property name, because some of the suits might be under that. But it's not often, it's also like looking into not just how many times like students have sued for bad conditions, but also how many times the landlord has sued. Because some landlords are, students are leaving town, and then landlords are suing because of conditions in the house that they feel, maybe it's over like, we always hear this thing about like the security deposit and the security deposit getting lost. But that's something that like the landlord might sue for. But some of these landlords are suing a lot and getting money from students too. And while it may be a very fair thing, sometimes it also may be a lack of like a student not documenting that like, hey, this actually wasn't my fault. This was an issue before I came into the house or something like that. And that gets me to my next point that Kimberly Francis like really addressed. She said it is like beyond important once you are moved into, well, actually not once you're moved in, prior to your move-in, video and photograph everything in the house. She said literally take your phone, stand outside your front door of your apartment or your house, and walk through the entire property prior to moving in. And then do the same thing at move out. Take the same exact video, kind of walking through the entire property, even going so far as to like showing you putting the keys to the place in the mailbox or wherever you've been directed to mail it. Because she said this type of documentation, if you are like a student who feels like, hey, like I kind of got cheated out of my security deposit, that type of documentation holds up well in court because you can't dispute that type of evidence. So that was something that she like really emphasized. Even if you feel like I'm not going to have a problem with my landlord coming in, like it's still good to document because you don't know what issues might arise. And she also said, like always back up those photos and videos on Google Docs, because like who knows what might happen to your phone. You might, break it or lose stuff. And she said like another thing to emphasize, because again, she works at the Center for Student Legal Services, and I don't know if I explained that, but for like anyone who's not aware, the Center for Student Legal Services is available to anyone who pays the $15 fee. I think you actually have to opt out of the Center for Student Legal Services, but otherwise they're available to anyone, and they deal with a lot of these tenant-landlord disputes. Kimberly said she works with a lot of them, but they also offer, and this was something that was like another piece of advice that she gave, like for students who haven't signed their lease yet, you can come in and do a lease review with the Center for Student Legal Services. So Kimberly or whomever is there will like sit down and read through your lease with you.
A lawyer.
Yes. So it's definitely something that's like a really wonderful service offered, because a lot of the times if you have these issues and you go to the Center for Student Legal Services, a lot of them will be resolved like without going to court. Like the landlord will resolve this issue with the tenant. It's rarer that you're actually going to have to like appear in court. But like more pictures and videos in court help, which was one of those things that she like emphasized. But yeah, I think that that's like pretty much it advice wise. She said that Kimberly said that the one thing she like really, really wanted to emphasize too was like, she said that she often sees a change in situations like with tenants and landlords when students are enforcing their rights, like knowing their rights and enforcing their rights. So she was like, don't hesitate to go to the Center for Student Legal Services if you feel like something, if you've been wronged or if you feel like your conditions like are bad in your place, like it doesn't hurt to go to the Center for Student Legal Services at all.
Yeah. Your students are probably paying for it.
Absolutely. And yeah, because like, I know like another thing that Pat McGee talked about, and I don't think I really talked about this, is like another big problem. And I talked about this transient population, but like when you graduate, the last thing you want to do is like be coming back to Athens and going into court. And I think that that's where a lot of these landlords are able to like not prey on students, but I think that landlords are in an easier position to sue or to have these issues with students because they're like, oh, whatever, I'll just not sue. I think that landlords are more like think it is easier to to like say, I'm not giving you your security deposit back or whatever, because students are going to say, whatever, I'm not getting my security deposit back. And they're going to kind of move on from that. And that's something that Pat McGee really said. He said, students pack their bags and leave for graduation, and the last thing they want to be dealing with is their landlord from college. But like, that's kind of what makes it easier for landlords to take advantage of these situations.
So you mentioned before they recommended people to look up the court docket for these landlords and landlord companies. Can you explain briefly just how somebody would go about doing that?
So you look up Athens County Municipal Court, and then you go to docket search, and then you click I'm not a robot, because you're not a robot. And then it just look up the last name. So like, for example, like my landlord's last name is Chapman. So I would look up Chapman and I would search it, and it would see if he's been seen at court. So it's a pretty easy process to go through. And you can also look up, so like I rent from Foster Place Properties. So I would look up Foster Place Properties if I was interested in seeing like if his rental company had ever appeared in court. So that's like definitely something that I recommend for anyone, because it was something that I kind of went through prior to signing, but just because it was something I knew about. And I think a lot of people don't think to do that or don't know to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
And that wraps it up here on Athens Happens. Make sure to tune in every Friday for new episodes that shed light on the politics that impact all of our lives. Remember, you can find the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and on YouTube in a video podcast format. Don't forget to leave us ratings and reviews. Also, be sure to check out our website at thenewpolitical.com, where we regularly report stories on what really happens here in Athens, and follow @thenewpolitical on social media. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.